The rhythmic, wet thump-thump of the human's heart filled the council's audio array, amplified until it resonated within my own thoracic plates. Ambassador Sable Quinn stood at the central podium, her focus fixed entirely on a small, hand-knitted scrap of blue wool she was rotating between her thumb and forefinger. Outside the reinforced obsidian viewports, the gravitational stabilizers hummed at a low, bone-shaking frequency of 50 Hz, yet Sable's pulse remained at a steady, mocking 60 beats per minute. Regarding the vulnerability clause in Section 4, Sable said, finally tucking the wool scrap into her sleeve. Her voice carried a flat, mid-frequency resonance that bypassed our translation filters. Earth requires a formal amendment to the standard duration of juvenile dependency. I leaned forward, my secondary ocular lenses clicking as they adjusted to the harsh, artificial glare of the chamber. I had been watching the ambassador for 3 hours, noting how she frequently tapped the glass face of her bulky wrist monitor. At first, I assumed the device was a life support tether, a mechanical crutch for a creature inhabiting a world with such thin, volatile oxygen. The galactic standard is 12 solar days, the council president stated, her crest twitching with the impatience of a species that reached maturity before its first molt. We have already granted Earth a generous extension of 30 days based on your atmospheric density. Sable didn't blink. She reached for a glass of water, the condensation slicking her palm, and took a measured sip. The liquid moved down her throat in a visible, rhythmic swallow that seemed to take an eternity in the sudden, heavy silence of the 400 delegates. 30 days would leave our offspring immobile, blind, and incapable of basic thermoregulation, Sable countered, setting the glass down with a muffled clack on the stone surface. A human infant requires a minimum of 3 years for basic self-sufficiency. The translation earpiece in my primary auditory canal emitted a sharp burst of static or perhaps our linguistic processors simply failed to find a biological precedent for the number. 3 years. Not rotations of a moon, but 3 full orbital cycles of a Class 12 Deathworld. 3 years, I repeated, my own vocal cords grating like shifting tectonic plates. You occupy a high-gravity environment teeming with viral pathogens and apex predators. Yet your young cannot survive independently for over 1,000 days? Sable tilted her head, her expression shifting into a mask of genuine, quiet bewilderment. Is that not normal? How do your young manage the caloric requirements of brain development in only 12 days? I looked at the data slate trembling in my grip. The biological cost was staggering. A species that dedicated 3 years of its primary resources to a single, helpless unit was not just inefficient. It was an evolutionary anomaly. The resources required for such a protection cycle, the president whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering across the obsidian floor. The sheer, logistical obsession needed to keep a soft, brain-heavy mammal alive in a predator-rich environment for that long. We don't just keep them alive, Sable said, her thumb tracing the edge of her wrist monitor again. We ensure they are never alone. Clicking rhythmically in a frantic, uneven tempo, the council president's mandibles betrayed his escalating terror. I accessed the secondary biological database, my digits trembling as the metadata for Homo sapiens. An entry previously dismissed as a statistical error, refreshed with terrifying clarity. The screen displayed a heat map of a nursery, a localized zone of extreme caloric expenditure and zero productivity. In every other quadrant of the galaxy, such a concentrated display of vulnerability would act as a beacon for every scavenger within 3 sectors. Yet, these terrestrials didn't hide their young in subterranean bunkers or launch them into the safety of a vacuum. They gathered in circles, facing outward, their entire societal architecture designed around a 3-year window of absolute, uncompromising defense. The data suggested that a parental unit's neurochemistry undergoes a permanent, aggressive rewiring upon the birth of an offspring, a biological state of perpetual combat readiness that lasts for decades. Sable adjusted her collar, smoothing the fabric over her shoulder with a slow, rhythmic motion of her palm. She glanced at the digital clock on the far wall and stifled a very small, very ordinary yawn. Caught in my throat, the words barely escaped as I looked at her. Ambassador, if your young are truly this defenseless, your race should have been extinct. Sable leaned forward, her pupils dilating until the blue of her eyes vanished into the black. My son Leo is 18 months old. He can barely hold a spoon without dropping it, and he cries when the lights go out. But if you touch him or the world he lives in, you will find out exactly why we haven't gone extinct. Broadcasted to every delegate, the spiking heart rate was a threat, not a failure. My sensors finally decoded the frequency of the wrist monitor. It wasn't a life support tether sustaining her through the low gravity. It was a rhythmic war drum. The human heart wasn't struggling to beat. The monitor was simply broadcasting the lethal, terrifying calm of a predator that had found something worth protecting. Treaties that had stood for millennia were shredded in the following hour. The Council didn't see a helpless species anymore. They saw a lineage of 4 billion persistence hunters who had spent their entire history, their very biology, perfecting the art of the guard. Every demand Earth had made was ratified without a single dissenting click. One human child had forced the galaxy into a state of permanent surrender, permanently. The greatest threat in the quadrant was currently learning to hold a spoon. Sable Quinn stood alone in the center of the emptying hall. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out the blue wool charm. The scrap of wool brushed against the glass face of her wrist monitor. A steady, amplified thump-thump vibrated through the obsidian floor. The heavy airlock door slid shut with a hiss of pressurized nitrogen.